Everyone. I'm Dr. Sally Blair, Senior Director for Fellowship Programs here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation, Russia as a Global Challenge, featuring Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellow, Dr. Lilia Shevtsova. We are delighted to have with us as discussants Christopher Walker, Vice President for Studies and Analysis here at NED, and Miriam Lanskoy, NED's Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now in our 17th year, the program has hosted more than 270 fellows from over 90 countries since its founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for her courageous commitment to democracy in Russia. Russia appears today as an assertive power, ready to weaken international norms and kick over the global chessboard. Even as it confronts economic stagnation and popular demoralization at home, it has advanced efforts not only in undermining the liberal order, but also in affecting domestic politics in the world's leading democracies. By holding manipulated elections and mimicking other democratic institutions, the Kremlin works to discredit these traditions, and in so doing, the West itself. This aggressive mobilization makes Russia the West's key opponent, but this new antagonism lacks clear and mutually accepted rules of the game. In her presentation today, Lilia Shevtsova will analyze the paradoxes of Russian-Western relations, the sustainability of the Russian system of governance, and the international implications of this system's struggle for survival. Lilia Shevtsova is a Russian political scientist, currently an associate fellow at Chatham House. Her distinguished career has included stints at the Brookings Institution, Carnegie Moscow Center, Cornell University, and Sciences Po, where she has conducted research and writing on issues relating to post-communist transformation, democratic transitions, and relations between Russia, the West, and Eastern Europe. She is a member of the editorial boards of the American Interest and the Journal of Democracy. Chris Walker is Vice President for Studies and Analysis here at NED. In this capacity, he oversees the department responsible for NED's multifaceted analytical work, which includes the International Forum for Democratic Studies. Previously, he was Vice President for Strategy and Analysis at Freedom House. Miriam Lanskoy is Senior Director for Russia and Eurasia here at NED. She holds a PhD in International Affairs from Boston University for her dissertation on the Russian presidency, the Chechen Wars, and social and political problems of the North Caucasus. She has 14 years of experience in political analysis and democracy promotion in post-Soviet Eurasia. We will now turn the floor over to Lilia, who will speak from the podium for approximately 25 minutes, followed by Miriam and then Chris for about 7 minutes each. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents, or by following the forum at Think Democracy and the Endowment at NEDemocracy. If you have not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And finally, let me take this opportunity to thank the many staff members involved with this event, most especially Research Associate Daniel Samet, who has offered vital assistance for the project and today's presentation. Lilia.
Thank you, Sally. Such a gracious introduction. Well, it's a privilege for me to speak at NED, and it's really pleasure. It's really a pleasure to have this wonderful panel. And for starters, I would like to admit something. You know, it looks amusing, and for me a bit worrying that Russia, together with Stormy Daniels, with commies, media blitz, and it seems to me his name is Mr. Cohen, Trump's lawyer, are the hot topics in the American discourse today. Because I do understand from my experience that to discuss the really popular topic would mean to simplify it and to look for juicy stuff. And I'm not sure that we need to follow the usual, way of Putiniana in discussing Russia. I mean Fareed Zakaria or David Brooks from New York style, when the Western American pundits and even politicians are trying to explain Russia by watching Mr. Putin's body language and trying to guess what he's thinking, why he has this stunning expression on his face. And in the end, trying to praise him as the most powerful, the most influential, brilliantly amazing, reckless political leader, which is not true and very far from true. I would like to ask you to bear with me because, in fact, I will be offering a rather boring agenda. In fact, I will offer 3 points on the table. And here are my points for discussion. Firstly, what is the logic of the Russian system of personalist power? I call it Russian matrix. What is the logic of its survival? And how sustainable, durable, and stable it is if it loses resilience now. Second point, do we read Russia right? If we read Russia right, why we make those awful mistakes, fallacies, and misperceptions, why we cannot predict what next in the Russia's chapter. And thirdly, what is in store for us during the next Putin's presidency. So I'm starting with the logic, rather boring, rather dull subject, but still, logic of the Russian matrix. What is it? I would say that myself, I never predicted that the Russian political class, after getting rid of the Soviet Union, will invent such an amazingly effective, successful mechanism of survival, of limping ahead even without having really serious resources. I would call this model of survival of post-communist Russia a triad that includes several policies on different echelons that contradict itself. It looks like, riding horses in opposite directions. So what are they? Firstly, to be with the West. It means to cooperate with the West, to be partner of the West, and of course to use Western resources, financial, technological. To be inside of the West, and this is real novelty for the Russian political elite comparing to the Soviet Union. To be inside of the West means to guarantee personal integration of the Russian establishment, business class, political elite, and the higher command into the Western society, into the Western structure. And to build a powerful lobbying machine with the participation of the Western political establishment. And third, the third element of the triad is to be against the West, to insulate the Russian society from the Western impulses, influences, and norms. And this model has been quite successful. Well, rather, it was successful, at least until 2014. This model allowed the Russian political establishment to trot ahead, to kick over the global chessboards, and even more. Russia and the Russian political class have become winners in the process of globalization and used pretty effectively post-modernity, the atmosphere of fuzzy norms and principles, ambivalence of standards, and lack of borders between norms and principles, between fair and unfair, justice, injustice, war and peace. The Russian political establishment really has been pretty successful to use ambiguity. And one has to make a comment here, being part of the globalized world. Of course, it's very difficult to us to imagine that the West could have been successful in containment and deterrence of Russian matrix. Why? Because if you are part of the Western community, of the Western financial system, and part of the Western lobbying machine, it's very difficult to contain you. So this kind of mechanism worked until 2014. Crimea annexation and Russia's war with Ukraine opened a new chapter in the evolution of the Russia's survival tactics. And in fact, we could call this kind of event shooting yourself in the foot, or maybe in the neck, too. Annexation opened a new period in Russia's development, in the evolution of the Russian system, and I would say it demonstrated two things. Firstly, it demonstrated the existence of rather suicidal impulses, instincts, within the Russian system, between the urge, to expand, to bully, to manipulate the outside world, on the one hand, and desire, urge, longing, and necessity to use the West. So this conflict is still not resolved. But secondly, we saw also the gravest Vladimir Putin mistake. He thought that the West will stomach his Ukrainian and Crimea gambit. The West had to stomach it because, according perhaps to Putin's experience and his experience of dealing with the Western establishment and with the Western political leaders, with Mr. Schroeder, Mr. Berlusconi, Mr. Chirac, Mr. Sarkozy, Mr. Blair, being polite, I am not using the names of the American presidents. Of course, Putin came to the conclusion that they will stomach it because, well, they did it so often for such a long time. That's why in 2011, 2012, the Russian foreign policy was updated, and the thesis that the West is weak and the Western epoch is over and we are filling the void became the major slogan of the Russian foreign policy. It looks like Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin miscalculated. And now the Kremlin has to cope with the new post-Crimea reality. Tough, serious, different, unexpected. And the Russian political elite has to look for a new incarnation of the previous such successful triad. And meanwhile, having not much resources are shrinking constantly, financial, political, moral, psychological, civilizational. The Kremlin had desperately to press one button, maybe without wishing to do that, the button of militarization, war patriotism, war paradigm. Yes, militarization and military patriotism has been successful. It helped to consolidate the nation. It helped to legitimize the new Putin's presidency. And it helped to consolidate, at least temporarily, society around the flag. And today, what do we have today? Today we have 88% of Russians say that they will not take part in protest activity. And only 8% will take part in the economic protests, and 6% in the protests with political agenda, compared with 19% last year. So militarization, besiege fortress mentality, has been effective, yes, definitely. But at the same time, pressing this button puts Russia in a very complicated situation, undermining the way of its existence and survival, successful during the 2 decades, and creating new traps, well, maybe conundrums for Russia. At least I will mention 2 of these traps and 1 challenge. One of the traps is the following: militarization of the budget and war paradigm, living in the war paradigm. Yes, on the one hand, it's successful, but losing its appeal. And at the same time, it's too huge a burden for the Russian budget. Americans could spend $121 million for the recent strikes in Syria, But for Russia to spend $2.5 million annually for Syria, it's a serious constraint. And besides, militarization means isolation, marginalization, and this is a huge blow, knockout blow for the status of Russia's great power. You cannot be great power if you're not sitting at the table with other most influential actors, if you're not member of the big concert. And besides, as I mentioned, the elite does not want to live in North Korea. They would like to live in Londongrad. The second trap or conundrum is the following. Russia and Russians, ordinary Russians, the elite Russians in cities, and in small compounds, they would like change. 70% of Russians, according to all estimates at social polls, they want change, yes. They want different change, political or economic. Mostly they want change from the top, but they want change. And the system does not allow change. And the leadership and the Kremlin cannot rock the boat. So that's why the urge, longing, thirst for change on the one hand, and inability to change. Because, well, there are no forces that could present an alternative. It makes Russia a kind of object hanging in the air, stuck. That's why, that's such a popular metaphor in Russia, comparing Russia to Titanic, looking for its iceberg. And how stable it is, how stable the situation is. In 2011, 2012, I had to admit I made a mistake because I thought that already the situation is so fragile, it starts to fragment. I was wrong, we were wrong. I mean, liberals, Democrats, wishful thinking people. We underestimated huge potential of the Russian political system, of Russia's matrix, of the Russian political regime. Because at least now we see several, I will mention only the list of 4, powerful stability factors that keep the system afloat. What are the factors? Firstly, fear. No, not that fear of repressions of the regime of the Kremlin, no, a different type of fear. Fear that dominates my mentality of Putin's critics, fear of repetition of 1991, fear of the fact that the regime collapse would mean the collapse of the state, and we don't know what will be repercussions. This is a nuclear state, and we really don't know. It's a new phenomena in the political history to what extent this kind of nuclear state and petrostate at the same time could be preserved within the current geographical format under democratic rule. Second, liberal democracy alternative is discredited in Russia. Discredited, first of all, by liberals, discredited by failure of outside liberal democracy, by the readiness of the Western political establishment to be part of the Russian laundry machine, by the fact that we don't have the West as a role model anymore. Thirdly, also very important stumbling block and stability factor for the system, the fact that we now understand that post-communist transition would be different from transition from the communism. We are different now. And first of all, we don't know how to split the merger, the marriage between power and property. And now we are looking all at Ukraine. Ukraine is trying to solve this problem. And finally, maybe the most dramatic issue is we don't know, maybe Mark will tell us whether it's possible or not, Mark. We don't know a single case in current political history, or maybe I am wrong. And Journal of Democracy should tell me that I am wrong. So far, I don't remember a single case when democratic transition was successful and effective without powerful Western influence, domination, and dictate, normative dictate. Oh, Mark is doubtful. But in any case, could Russia perform its own democratic transition without the normative dictate on the part of the West. So why doubt? And are we ready? We, not only political elite, establishment, conservatives, are kind part of the society, but we liberals. Are we ready for limited Russia's sovereignty? I don't know, because to say it openly would be suicidal. And very shortly, on the need, secondly, I know Bob Nurek already listened to my mantra on that. Sorry, Bob. Very shortly, on the need of to reassess. When I'm reading what I wrote, when I'm reading what my colleagues wrote, I very often have a feel of shame, maybe without blushing too much. But I do believe that we have to reassess a lot of conclusions regarding Russia and the West, including, role of Yeltsin, liberals, the role of West in the 90s, the motives behind Russia's Crimea annexation, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we need to do it. We need to do a collective repentance. And I don't know why we haven't started it. Maybe we need another Matti Lipset to do it for us. But in any case, I will give you only several examples from the list of popular axioms, and I'm taking these conclusions and axioms from the reports of very serious Western think tanks from January, February, March. These axioms definitely have to be reassessed, rethought. One of them, conclusion of the very serious report, big report. Russia wants confrontation with the West. Really? Well, definitely, we understand that traditional Russian mechanism of dealing with the West is to escalate in order to de-escalate, to escalate in order to force the West, to corner the West, and get the West to agree to the Russian bargain, to the Russian rules of the game. Yes, Putin has been trying pretty successfully until recently, not anymore. And at the time being, well, today, we definitely see how the Russian president is trying to find exits, to find, ways to climb down from this escalation tree, proposing different peaceful initiatives. Yes, some lieutenants are barking, but let's look at his rhetoric. Let's look at his behavior. He decided to forget about Russian casualties just recently in Syria, when Americans, in fact, whacked down at least more than 100 Russian mercenaries. Putin apparently has been happy after all these negotiations during the deconfliction mechanism when the latest strikes went so peacefully, symbolically, and didn't force Russia to react. Because definitely, Kremlin doesn't want escalation of confrontation. But at the same time, the Kremlin doesn't know how to backtrack without losing face. Losing face is so important. The second, well, I will skip over some of the best axioms, but for instance, one more axiom, very popular. Russians would like to live only if Russia is a superpower. I'm not quoting just word on word, but usually this is the axiom. Really? Well, the recent polls demonstrate that there is a kind of cognitive dissonance within the Russian society. And 42%, Russian society is split, 42% of Russians think that Russia should be superpower with potential to scare the world, to bully the world, to slap the world. But more than 50% of Russians believe that superpower means the country that guarantees well-being, and not necessarily the most important country, but, well, normal country. That's totally new evolution of the Russian political mentality. And there are so many other views, and people are still writing on these topics. So many shelves are occupied. I don't know whether you've got this new essays about Russia as the polar of Eurasia. I just wanted to use not a normative word. What kind of Eurasia without Ukraine? when Kazakhstan is trying and Belarus are trying to escape Russia's embraces. Some of my colleagues continue to write the books on Russia-China Entente. My God, when both countries in both capitals, we do understand that we pretend Russia is moving towards totalitarian regime. How come totalitarian regime without idea? Yes, soft, fragile, authoritarian regime could be worse than totalitarian regime because we don't have rules of the game. But this is totally different reality. So are we ready, Russian and Western Russia hands, for some kind of repentance? This for me is a rhetorical, very important question. And final comment. I would better skip it over, but final comment about future Putin's presidency. Irrespectively of what President Putin is thinking, irrespectively of what his team is thinking, Russia has entered the last chapter of Putin's leadership. And drama of President Putin is, and he definitely is a smart person, and definitely has to understand what drama is. Drama is that the leader is presiding over his own political agony and watching this agony, trying to pretend that he doesn't see his own weakness. He has nothing to offer Russia, with the exception of stale menu that stinks. And not only minority, 15% of Russian liberal minority will not accept this kind of rot as status quo situation. Hardly President Putin could satisfy even his loyalists within the political class and the so-called oligarchy, which is not oligarchy, of course, but still, his own traditional base. Because he cannot guarantee, look at sanctions regime, he cannot guarantee their interest and well-being. And what about the traditional basis, his own electorate, about the people who voted for him, but at the same time, 70% of Russians have problems to cope with their lives and living standards. 25% of Russians have no money to pay their rent. It's a totally different situation. Will they tolerate further falling down of their living standards? Poverty. And one question that is so popular in Moscow, we are all betting, guessing, etc. Guess what the question? The question is, to what extent President Putin controls the development, his own verticality, the state, his own power, the Kremlin's corridors, and endemic corruption, rot, along the whole verticality, helplessness, lack of vision. Well, everything says that apparently he has lost control over this monster, and maybe we could come to conclusion that what we have now, it's impotent omnipotence. And to have impotent omnipotence in time of trouble, in time when you have so many bumps beneath the surface, it's a pretty scary development. In any case, the regime change will be inevitable, the problem of time, the problem of price. But definitely, it will open the windows, the doors, and we'll have all these emotions sealed and kept under the surface emotions. Helplessness and hopelessness, anger, rage will get to the surface. And the question will be who will ride the tide at the moment, and whether the political elite could control those emotions in the situation when there are no rules, no taboos, no institutions. Who will control this tornado? In any case, the current lull, the current paralysis is deceptive. And Russia is pregnant with change, definitely pregnant with change. And the major question for us, the big question is whether the change will be peaceful or revolutionary. Regretfully, the authorities are doing everything energetically to make the latter inevitable. I thank you for your attention, and I am looking forward to my colleagues. It seems to me, your turn?
Miriam first. Lilia, thank you for surprising us and engaging us and being your brilliant self, giving us a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. But before we open up, we will have comments first from Miriam and then from Chris. So I'll turn the floor over to Miriam.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally, and thanks to the forum and Lilia, as always, just brilliant. And those were remarkable comments that are just extremely provocative and interesting. So let me just kind of look at some of the threads that I'd like to pull out. One is this question of Russian strength. Is Russia really that strong, or is this situational? Is it dependent on a lot of other factors? Does it just seem strong? And I agree that there's, so the fundamental narrative that Russians want change and the reason for the militarism and confrontation is actually domestic. It's rooted in the protests that we saw back in 2010, 2011, and the desire to keep that down. And therefore, Putin has such a, Putin circle around him. Kolesnikov has this phrase where he says they wake up in the morning, they look in the mirror, and they see Gaddafi, Mubarak, Assad, Maduro, that I just identify completely Yanukovych with that kind of figure. So what we've seen in the last few years is Russia providing very real and very significant support to rogue states. We saw in Syria, for instance, where Russia has played a remarkable hand. They weaponized refugees, causing a problem for Europe. They have, apart from weapon sales, oil fields, they have tremendous ability to limit what the U.S. does on the ground, and they're a serious power broker with leverage over the other major powers that is far greater now than it was a few years ago. So they have greater leverage over Iran, Turkey, and so forth. So they sure seem strong, but that may just be Putin taking advantage of a vacuum. It might be highly situational as opposed to some kind of strength in absolute terms. Similarly, but it makes it no easier to resolve in the situation that we have now. Venezuela, there's a similar ideological component, and there's a financial bailout of Maduro of $10 billion, diplomatic support, and so forth. And all of this is, these are problems for the United States, these are problems for democracy, these are problems for the world. So and we can say that, again, that it's situational. In terms of Americans getting Russia wrong, I think that's very true. We've seen it for 25 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, where most of American foreign policy thinkers kind of said Russia might be helpful, but really it's kind of irrelevant. It's certainly not a player on the global scale. We're very surprised by Russia emerging over the last few years, and maybe now we're tending the other way and are overstating it. I did find, I would say there was one person who I thought commented really very well, and that was McMaster in his last speech at the Atlantic Council a couple of weeks ago, which was a remarkable speech. And he shifted from the hard power issues. He talked a bit about NATO and so forth, but then he shifted to talking about American society and the dynamism of American society, American universities. He was saying, I would want Russians to see our companies, our ability to innovate, our ability to, the creativity of American society. And he ended on a note that, first of all, we have to recognize that we need to compete, which is unfamiliar to us. We've, for 25 years, thought we don't need to compete with anyone, that we're just dominant. We need to compete as societies, but we also have to find the will to pursue our values. And that, to me, is a key thought. And in terms of how do we help Russia transform, there's an incredible battle that's going on today over technology, with the Russian government having decided yesterday to block a messenger service called Telegram. Telegram is using something called collateral freedom, where a local company hides behind the tech giants. So it's using cloud providers through Amazon and Google that are essentially, Russia has to block Google or Amazon in order to block Telegram, and they're not willing to do that. And the way this drama is playing out right now is Russian censor is blocking millions of IP addresses, but it can't hit Telegram. And so far, Telegram is active. And it's a great story that's kind of unfolding in front of us, which is about ingenuity and creativity, using technology in interesting ways. It's about solidarity, and it's about having that will to stand up to authoritarians, and it's, at the moment, entirely about civil society. So this is, watch the space. It's a very important standoff that's taking place. And I'll stop there, that it's with our values that we try to help Russia transition.
Thank you, Miriam. Chris?
So I'll try briefly to just build on Lilia's remarks and Miriam's comments. I think Lilia pointed out in her remarks that Russia brings an enormous number of contradictions. So on the one hand, I think as Lilia and Miriam also touched on, it's a very weak country in so many ways, observable ways, in terms of its economy, the level of dynamism or absence thereof in economic terms. But at the same time, it's dynamic beyond its borders, I think, in ways that most analysts underestimated, certainly looking from the perspective of, say, 15 or 20 years ago. It's stultifying in many ways in terms of political discussion internally, but it's also pretty innovative when it comes to using technology to prevent speech of political consequence in a systematic way. That's no small thing. There too, I think if you turn the clock back 15 or so years, most people were saying at the time that the digitalization of speech and information would, by most counts, lead to a much more open and dynamic Russia. That hasn't happened in quite the way people imagined. It's insular in many ways, but it's also internationalist. And here too, I think this was grossly underappreciated by so many analysts, certainly going back a few years. And I'll just give some quick examples to run down the list, maybe as a way to generate a bit of discussion. I think 10 years ago, or a little bit over 10 years ago, was the cyber attack on Estonia, which in some ways was the first visible indicator of this sort of malign internationalism. There may have been other examples, certainly anyone from the Baltic states predating 2008, 2007 would be very familiar with this. But this was a kind of visible indicator that used modern technology, an attack on democracy, free expression, and on the integrity of a democratic state in a visible way. There was Georgia a year later, and by and large, I think the conventional wisdom was, well, this is overstretch. Russian authorities are playing with a weak hand, and this is really overstretch. And then there was the annexation of Crimea, and people said, my gosh, that's really overstretch. And then there was the invasion of Donbass, and people said, wow, how can this be? Sanctions are now being imposed. The economy already was in great shakes. Before that, all sorts of need of reform. Nevertheless, this happened. And then Syria happened, and people said, wow, that's really something. Now we have this whole string of internationalist activities that really defied the conventional logic. And I think one thing that we've all underestimated from the democracy's point of view is how authoritarian states can marshal their resources for the regime's preferences. And so my suspicion is that the bulk of the resources, the hydrocarbon wealth that Russia enjoys, isn't going to rebuild hospitals and schools and do these sorts of things, but it's being marshaled for the sorts of activities I just described. And beyond that, we see the sort of activities which maybe aren't as expensive, but nevertheless require some significant investments to get into the democratic media and political systems of the countries of Central Europe, Western Europe, Southeastern Europe, and in North America. That's no small thing. Nevertheless, I think that's defied much of the conventional analysis that people held going back a dozen years ago, 15 years ago. And so I guess one of the questions is, should we rely on the longstanding conventional wisdom, or should we rethink the ability of countries which don't rely on open media, free debate, political competition to change? Change will come, I'm confident of that. I remain an optimist, but the question is when. If it happens 10 years from now rather than 2 years from now, that's a big difference. And that has the same sort of implications that one could imagine with change having occurred 8 years ago rather than 10 years from now. And so I think these things all play into the kind of matrix of understanding not only the ability of ordinary Russians to have a more prosperous set of opportunities, but the implications of an increasingly authoritarian regime in an internationalist context, projecting now increasingly its kleptocracy beyond its borders, which, as Lilia alluded to, has enormous implications for the integrity of democratic institutions in so many ways that people like Karen DeWisha, who I just say a word, who recently passed away, it's really a tragic loss. Someone who's devoted so much work and attention to these sorts of efforts. And so I think more needs to be done to understand this in the coming term. But I would just put that out there as a frame of reference for understanding the challenge that Russia presents today.